Hi folks, Hasidus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. And I've got my morning too much coffee cough. But in this essay, I'd like to talk about the advent of lynchings, black lynchings, these extra, judicial lynchings in the United States between 1830 and the late 1950s. Now, there's a black lesbian activist has recently been, putting out propaganda in the US about a particular lynching that she focused on from the 1950s, where a black teenager was supposedly lynched by a white mob. Now, this lynchings thing sort of conveniently has been hijacked by the race grifters and race baiters, and then create this as a uniquely evil white supremacist, fascist Nazis oppressing the helpless black people, Hitler. And this is the way it's being portrayed in the propaganda and projected. And again, most of the issue, in fact, if not 99.9% of the race issues are merely asserted rather than proved. So they're going down the classic ideological path that the Soviets, the communist Soviet agitators, began in the 1930s in the United States to stir up race division and so on. So that it's very much that playbook. And if you look at the placards and the posters that the black activists were waving around, even in the mid-1950s or earlier, they bear a striking resemblance in talking point type structure to the activism today. Now, remember, that was nearly all Soviet communist agitator organized and arranged and so on. And yet you see almost exactly the same structural argument today, some 70 years later, suggesting that the Marxist architecture of class struggle and waste struggle and all this sort of thing is still being used almost exactly as it was conceived by the Soviet communist agitators and stirrers back in the day. But let's have a closer look at this. Now, I should sort of add, anyone that thinks they can, at any time that goes around arbitrarily grabbing folks and hanging them, it's not acceptable. The idea that you'd hang anyone that way, or in terms of thinking you're meting out justice. We need to understand in backdrop terms that this idea of the police force and the middle class and surveillance cameras, all this, that didn't exist back then. I mean, there weren't even streetlights and so on. So we're talking about a very different world, and hanging was an accepted way across the world, not simply in the United States, but everywhere. In the most sophisticated and advanced societies of the day, whether we would see them as sophisticated now is another matter, but back in the day, sophisticated, they all had hanging or things like the guillotine in France and so on. Now, the French fancied themselves at the cutting edge of social justice and equality and all that sort of thing, and they were chopping people's heads off with the guillotines. So this idea that there were gentle and humane ways of doing this sort of thing that should that we see today, well, don't send them to be hanged, just assign a social worker to sort them out. I mean, problem solved. That sort of mentality didn't exist then, and is of questionable benefit and value today. But that was the accepted way of dealing with people. Hanging was it. So this idea that hanging was in itself a terrible thing is nonsense. That's how things were at the time. Bit of a gruesome way to go, I imagine, but there were some very skilled hangmen, as they were called, that would use a very thick but well-oiled or greased rope, and they would put weights on the person's feet, so that when they were dropped from the rope, that the neck would snap immediately and they'd be dead sort of on the instant. rather than sort of hang there for hours, slowly strangling to death. But some of the people that were doing these extrajudicial hangings weren't that choosy over the arrangements, and so you can imagine that some people would have taken a while to be choked to death or something on the end of the rope, which, by the way, in places like rural England at the time, where they were skilled and capable, weren't hanging around, no pun intended, they weren't around, sometimes people would still be choking to death 24 hours later at the end of the rope. That's how crude things were in the time. Coming back to this idea, I just want to go through the stats. Now, bear in mind that pretty much all the stats you can get today are heavily propagandized by activists and race grifters and so on. So, I haven't spent a vast amount of time researching this and haven't even scripted this video. So I'm doing this sort of put together after a few hours of sort of reading around and gathering some bits and going off the top of my head. So nonetheless, to the best of my sort of judgment on this, going after hard facts, not assertions, not hyperbolic propaganda and hysterical propaganda, just taking all that out of the information, then 74% of the lynchings, and even these are hard to get because the timeline jumps. They can say there was X thousand of lynchings between 1830 and 1959, but then that same amount of lynchings is said to occur between 1870 and 1930. So trying to get the timeline and the number of lynchings to match and line up is not easy, and I'm suspecting that really it's not known, and a lot of the numbers are just simply purely invented, some fantasy fiction that they pull out of thin air to try and juice it all up. Nonetheless, the best I can get was 74% of lynchings were of black people, 2% were women, 2% were Hispanic, just under 1% were American Indian, 1% were Asian. That includes all Asians, by the way, so Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, even Pacific Islanders and that sort of thing are seen all to be lumped into that, and 20% white. So this idea that it was only blacks being lynched by all white lynch mobs and it was racism and white supremacy and this and that next thing is quite absurd. 1 in 5 was white. Now, the things that strike me, and this goes against the propaganda, that in areas where Hispanics were far more numerous than black people, so Hispanics were far more numerous than black people, the amount of Hispanics being dispatched through these extrajudicial hangings, lynchings, was very low. Even in areas where the Hispanics substantially outnumbered the black people, it was still very low. And I don't get that. If indeed it was racism, if indeed it was white supremacy, if it was those evil fascist white folks, then why weren't they hanging the Hispanics in the same rate as the blacks, or similar, or at least more, especially where there were more Hispanics than black people? You would think that, but even in areas where the Hispanics were more numerous, and where even American Indians were as numerous as black people, it still was the case that the American Indians and Hispanics were being lynched at a much lower rate than the black people. Now, why was that? I don't get. If it was just pure racism and white supremacy, then there would have been mass lynchings of all people who weren't white. Why were so few Asians? Even in areas where there were like the gold fields and parts of the railway buildings, say in the 1870s, particularly towards the West Coast, where there were a lot of Chinese workers and labourers and their families and so on, there was very few lynchings of Chinese people. Now, if it was just this crazed era of lynching, which it wasn't, by the way, but if it were, and that it was all white people lynching everyone else, then why were the other categories, even when they were in the majority, why were the other categories of lynching so low? Why were black lynchings uniquely high? Let's assume the propagandists have done a big job of inflating the numbers and just go, well, we don't know how many, so why don't we just make it a big dramatic figure, which is very much the propaganda method. But again, it comes back to why weren't, if it was a white supremacy, white evil racists oppressing everyone that wasn't white, then why weren't the other races, such as the Hispanics, why weren't they being lynched at the same rate? It doesn't really make any sense. Similarly, given that there's much juice made of black women being lynched by these evil white mobs, then why was it that there was, you know, the rate of why was it so few black women were lynched? Given that it was supposed to be this universal thing of, you know, no black woman was safe from these evil white mobs and so on. That doesn't fit up. Otherwise, there'd be many more black women being lynched. Now, there's a few things sort of to go through in terms of, you know, the goings on at the time. 1835 to 1959 seems to be the most settled sort of timeline I can find, but there's generally, if you look at sort of any details, some of these include photographs, by the way, if you look at any details of things like these alleged lynchings, there doesn't appear to be any real effort to make, you know, to keep record details that can be reviewed, you know, for historical accuracy later on, till maybe the mid 1880s, and that seems to have come along with the advent of photographs. Now, bear in mind that a photograph would take something like you know, a few minutes from the time you shoot it to the time you can remove the plate and start developing it. You know, the exposure can take over a minute. So, you know, photography was really a professional occupation at the time. You had to know your stuff in terms of, you know, handling the equipment, which is quite bulky, and the you know, the chemicals involved and so on. So so photographs were taken with this. Now, this is now painted as ghoulish. You know, those evil white people even taking photographs of their black victims. That just shows what a bunch of racist Nazis they were. No, that's nonsense. You know, almost every hanging, you know, in things like government jails and prisons, you know, where the state controlled the whole exercise, photographing the person before and after the hanging was how things were done at the time. And in the same way that painting portraits of people who, especially, you know, wealthier people who were, say, executed by guillotine or you know, the axe man chopping a head off or something like that, as it was in the medieval times, that people could ask for, hey, I need a portrait before you cut my head off. Hey, buddy, you know. And sometimes, you know, people's heads would be cut off and then they'd realize there was no portrait, so they employed people to stitch the head back on in order to paint the portrait. So this idea that there's something uniquely white and ghoulish, that's nonsense, you know, absolute nonsense. Now, there were, you know, I've looked at a number of episodes that are described in very propaganda, you know, terms. You know, a real race grifter trying to juice it all up, and the assertion that every black person who was lynched was it was a terror lynching by evil white mobs. You know, that can be rejected just out of hand. Reject that. Don't accept that propaganda for a minute. I guess there's a few things to look at, and if you read, say, you know, histories of the United States during that time, say 1840 to 1890, particularly in the, you know, the Midwest, particularly in the, you know, the Midwest, southern Midwest, and you know, heading further west, the less developed areas. You know, it's different maybe in downtown New York or something, but in these newly developed areas, you could wait months for the district judge to come around and hear a case. So, and depending on the weather, because the roads were, there's no like roads then, depending on the weather and things like that, then it could take even longer. Also, people had to be assigned an attorney. So you have attorneys traveling around that some would do pro bono, others not. And they would, the judge would arrive, but then there was no lawyer for the accused. Or that there were lawyers in town to hear other cases, but they didn't have time. They had to move on to the next town to hear other cases there, or they'd done enough pro bono, they weren't going to do any more, and those sorts of things. So the case would be postponed while the proper bits were put in place, such as the judge and the attorneys. So sometimes these things, they could wait months. So the local police authorities would say, look, we'll put the person in prison, whoever it was, could be white or black person, put them in prison, but we're not going to be able to bring them to trial for a month or 3 months or 6 months. This is in the more rural areas, remote areas, and Georgia and places like that, fit into that category. So the angry mobs would say, well, there's no doubt about the guilt here. Let's get on with it, and that happened whether the people were white or not, or black or not, or white or not. That would happen. So this idea that it was uniquely white people against uniquely black people, that's simply nonsense. Now, also there were things like that they love to talk about, say, the 1906 Atlanta riots, the race riots as they call them in Georgia, and this is the race riot they call them in Georgia, and this is juiced up as a race riot where thousands, millions, hundreds of millions were killed by evil fascists, and that's not. There are some propagandists claim as many as 100 were killed, but as we can see from January 6th, the propagandists, once they get to work, they certainly are colourful in how they depict the events. 21 people, here's one saying, well, 21 people were killed, and there was 19 black people and two white people were killed. And this idea that it was a one-way riot with white trying to run around and kill blacks, that's nonsense. And I'll come back to some of the causes for these riots. Now, here's another one where this is a description of that's meant to indicate, wicked, evil, white racism and so on. There's some black militants. This is in the late 1890s. Some black militants in the South are having a meeting one night, and they're talking about how they're going to go out and kill white people. And the police hear about this, and so they go in to break up the meeting and take the names of the people who are there. So the police turn up and say, "Hey guys, come out and let's see let's see some ID or whatever let's see your faces and so on." The black people inside say, "No, you can get lost, and we're not doing nothing." And before you know it, there's a shootout going. So here's these helpless, innocent black people. These oppressed, helpless and innocent black people. No agency, oppressed by evil white fascists, and the police being the spear of the wicked fascistness. And yet somehow these black people in the meeting are fully armed and tooled up and have a full-on shootout with the police. Now, that doesn't sound like a bunch of victims to me, so trying to present it as the oppressed blacks. Then they move to the next phase and say, well, all right, then, okay, so they were a bunch of militant, violent folks with guns, but it's the white people made them do it, so it's still damn whitey fascist fault that this has happened. No. If you're gathering together with guns, threatening to go out and shoot people, and the police turn up, it's not you're not in a good place. This idea that it's white fashion is nonsense, and can be rejected out of hand. Now, the modern day kickoff, where it really sort of got going, was this idea of blacks being arbitrarily hanged by evil white mobs. And it's been a kind of a favoured sort of situation where black activists from all areas have jumped on this bandwagon, even from the 1950s onwards, or even earlier than that. If we look at Billie Holiday's song "Strange Fruit," that's an activist song. It's dressed up today as being a courageous protest song by a courageous black woman. That's nonsense. Billie Holiday was coked out off her head half the time, and sure, she had a great voice, and there are some Billie Holiday songs that I quite like that were written by a prominent black songwriter at the time, Arthur Herzog Jr. Billie Holiday even wrote the words to some of those songs. All of Me. I mean, if you can look it up in or Google it, Billie Holiday, All of Me. All of Me. Da, da, da. I mean, it's a great song, and if you get a big band, sort of jazz band behind it, it's a good song. Even today, it stands up. And one I play on the guitar, incidentally. Now, Emmett Till was the name of a black kid or teenager who was lynched in the 1950s, and this is he was quickly, that was all jumped on as he was like a poster child of white racism and arbitrary lynchings and that type of thing, and he was used ruthlessly and mercilessly as a propaganda tool. Now, at the time, there was a lot of activism in the South surrounding some of the Jim Crow type, what are today called like the Jim Crow laws and that sort of stuff. We can look at them in a minute as well, but there was a lot of Marxist Jewish activists, or wait a minute, Marxist activists running around the South who were white and who were nearly all Marxist and nearly all Jewish. And again, if we see all those social justice type movements from the mid-50s through to the early 70s, and every level, whether it be gender, whether it be race, whether it be anything, there is an incredible over-representation of Jewish people. It could simply be a coincidence. I'm not singling anything out, but maybe it's just coincidence. For example, in the feminist movement, the fact there were so many Jewish lesbians, maybe that's coincidence. I don't know. And the same goes for the race activism in the South. They were, white Jewish people from the Northeast, very much steeped in Marxist sort of theory, who were coming to the South and telling the black people, you're oppressed by those evil white folks. And when the tensions would rise and black people would start to sort of arbitrarily try and assert themselves in ways that weren't legal, then there was going to be pushback, and then the activists could say, see, there you go, look at that oppression. And so it's very much a constructed thing, which is how the Soviet agitators worked in the 1930s and through into the 1980s. Now, the deal is that Emmett Till is supposedly, called out sexual innuendos or slurs to a white woman is the allegation. And now, Emmett Till came from a very violent family, lived in a violent neighbourhood. Is depicted as a helpless little shrinking violet, which is simply untrue. And he was quite wrongfully, by the way. You don't go around just arbitrarily grabbing people and hanging them, for goodness sakes. So let's be quite clear. It was a criminal act. If a law had been broken, it should have been brought to the attention of the authorities, and the proper procedure and the rule of law and due legal process rigorously applied. And if it was, if the state failed to prove its case, assuming the matter would even get to court, but if the state failed to prove its case, then that Emmett Till, whoever it may be, it doesn't matter who it is, must walk free out of the courtroom and like any other citizen, be guaranteed their safety by the state. So clearly we're looking at illegality here. There's no question that whether or not that Emmett Till should have been a poster child for this lynching business is another matter. Now, but as fate would have it, his mother was. They say she was an educator, but not a teacher. I don't know what that even means. But anyway, let's assume she's a teacher for the mum. Turns out she was sort of, as black people go, fairly well spoken. She's quite a good public speaker, and so. And an activist anyway. She's already an activist, and so she was easily hijacked by the activist sort of class, and went on a travelling roadshow, for goodness sakes, talking about the evils of those bad white people and so on. So she became, so that sort of kicked off the modern era and really framed how these lynchings would be, how they would be used, projected and propagandized in even up to the present day, so that it was some huge and terrible injustice. I mean, you need to, and you see this even now. I noticed when I've gone around, I used to go to the United States, not so much recently, but used to go to the United States a lot. I was there on business sort of all the time, and if I would walk down a street, and in America it's funny, you can walk down a couple of blocks of a city street, and it's all very, very, white and business and commercial. And then you get to the next block and suddenly it's very down at heel, and there's lots of black people sort of hanging around on the street corners and out on the street fronts, begging and catcalling and calling out and calling out some rather obscene things. And in terms of racial slurs, I've been subject to many racial slurs simply because I walk through the wrong street or down the wrong block on the street. And the local white people, they know that, hey, you go 2 blocks here, then you turn left, buddy. But being a dude from out of town, I didn't know that. And there was a bunch of shoe shiners, I remember, on one corner who called out that I should come and get my shoes shined. And when I said very politely, thank you, no. And which would have been pointless. It was still a lot of snow on the ground, and but anyway, the verbal abuse I got. So the hang around street, I've noticed that they hang out on the streets. Certainly where I've seen it, anyway, calling out to women and making a lot of how can I say, sexual suggestions about intimate acts and things like that, and there seems to be a culture of that type of behaviour. And going through black neighbourhoods in the States, I've noticed the same thing. They all seem to sit out in the front on their porches and that sort of thing, calling out, and it seems to be just the way things are done. If you go to Africa, you go into a place where there's got majority black African people there, which is in all of Africa, by the way. Then they tend to talk very loudly because it's viewed in African culture. If you talk quietly, then you're plotting against somebody. Whereas if you talk loudly so everyone can hear you, then you're you're an honest, upstanding sort of person that's not trying to hide anything. And that's very much part of African culture that the African Americans have sort of kept with them to quite a large extent in their own communities. Similarly, in African communities, it's quite normal for one woman to have many male partners. The lineage is female rather than male in that sense. So as you've seen, by the way, in a lot of Pacific Islanders too. So that's a completely different sort of social structure, which again the black people seem to have largely kept in the United States, even 300-400 years after they first arrived in the United States. So there's a different sort of social structure and culture now. Now, once the slavery had ended, then you have situations of unemployment and things where there's large numbers of black people with nothing to do. And particularly with, say, the automation that started to come into farming and the like, this reduced the amount of agricultural jobs, or the menial, the lowest level agricultural jobs, which displaced a lot of black people. So they were on the city streets and on the town streets, nothing to do, getting drunk, calling out calling out to the white women as they went by. And you can see some tensions come from that. Now, there's a couple of other things that are worth noting too. There was a large migration, say in the late 1800s, and certainly, starting after World War One, where there was a huge boom in industry in the north, where all the factories were, places like Detroit and the like. And so a lot of black people from the south moved to the north during this time, places like Chicago and Michigan generally, Detroit and so on. So and elsewhere in the north, wherever there was large manufacturing centres. So there was a bit of a labour shortage at the time, particularly the entry level jobs, and the black people moving from the south, and they were almost encouraged to do so. Move to the north and so there's this sudden arrival of large numbers of southern sort of agricultural, rural black people arriving in the north, and this wasn't received too well, as you can imagine, by local communities. But the land was quite cheap in Chicago at the time and around there, so black families could move from the south, Georgia, somewhere like that, could move to the north and still could afford to buy a modest house. So it seemed to sort of work fairly well all around, or economically at least. Now, when the Depression came, so as it started to bite in 1930, 1931, then there was a lot of unemployment, particularly at the lower levels there, and there's a lot of black people were then put out of work, and so that there was a lot of crime developing there, and particularly in Chicago, you had guys like Al Capone running around and so on, prohibition, things like that. So that created a bit of a smouldering situation that again, race grifters and so on could spread a lot of discord in. Now, there's a couple of other things I'll mention too. There was, again, this is on the propaganda side. There was the 1906 Atlanta riot. Now, if you look at the propaganda around that riot, and I mentioned a little bit earlier, the propagandists are saying that black people were driving cars. Now, in 1906. I mean, how many fucking cars would have been around in 1906? How many black people would have owned a car in the southern United States in 1906? I mean, one in every 5 million or something. So the propaganda says black people are driving down the streets in their automobile, minding their own business, coming home from church, and white mobs fell upon them, dragged them out of the cars, and beat them to death, and so on. That's clearly some zit-faced punk activist kid today who thinks that, automobiles and the world around the automobiles and everything has been around forever. So you look at the propaganda and you laugh at most of it. But I just wanted to give some perspective to that, and I'll close off by the Jim Crow laws, which are roundly condemned, and I don't think they're a good thing, by the way. But again, the propaganda has been infused into the discussion. There's no rational or sensible debate on it all. There was when black people or universal franchise came in, there was many blacks were completely illiterate, and they couldn't even read the enrolment forms, or they couldn't read the main method of distributing political literature at the time, which is like the newspapers and so on. Or the radio even, but not all black people had a radio. So again, we're talking 1940s, 1950s, around that time. There were still plenty of places in Texas, by the way, that didn't have electricity in the 1950s, and in the southern United States, just to illustrate how those sort of services were still yet to be distributed around the US to everybody. So there was what a number of districts, electoral districts did, and states did, was so you can't vote unless you can read well enough to know what the enrolment procedure is. So there was now this didn't mean that it was a restriction of franchise in an absolute sense of you can't vote, buddy. I mean, if you can't read, you can't enroll. If you can't enroll, you can't vote. So that was it. So the idea that was voter suppression, I don't accept. Now, if somebody says to you, for example, the enrolment is in French, for example, the enrolment's in French, and if you want to enroll to vote, you better go and learn enough French to be able to understand the enrolment form. And you have the choice: you go off and learn French, or you don't enrol. Or you can lobby your local Congress to say, hey, can we do something about this? So there are ways of dealing with it. But instead of that, it was assumed that agitation and drama and street marches and so on was the solution. Now, there was plenty of white people that couldn't read, not as many as there were black people, but there were plenty of white people who couldn't read. Again, the rural farmer, who either never went to school or left school at 10 years old, and by the time they reach 30, they can barely read. They're effectively and functionally illiterate. They didn't get the right to vote either. They couldn't enrol. So the idea was strictly a race thing is an absolute grotesque untruth. Anybody that couldn't meet that standard, being able to understand the enrolment form or read it and understand it, couldn't vote. And so that was how it was. Now some are saying, yeah, well, it kind of was, or read it and understand it, couldn't vote, and so that was how it was. Now some are saying, yeah, well, it kind of was in order to give whites the majority of voters in that area. I don't doubt something like that would have gone on. So the idea that it was perfectly this or that, or 100% this way, 100% that, I do accept there were some crossovers there. But this idea that it was uniquely against black people is simply untrue, and something the propagandists are putting about today. So when you hear all this propaganda and see it all, whether it be about lynchings or Jim Crow laws, always have another look and evaluate it for yourself. And I think you'll find you'll come away with a much different view. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.